This podcast contains our own personal views not associated with any organisation. Coronial contains descriptions of death inquests that may be graphic and disturbing to some listeners. Discretion is advised.
All right, welcome back everyone to Coronial. I'm Georgie.
I'm Emma.
And I'm Alice.
All right, this week I am going to be telling you guys about the death of John Posnikidis. Apologies if that is not at all how you say it. Call him John from now on, that's probably a good choice. He was a 42-year-old man when he died as a result of multiple injuries when he was struck by a semi-trailer on Tuesday the 12th of October in 2010 at approximately 8:40 a.m. He was sitting in a bus shelter.
Is this the Adelaide one? Yeah, I remember this at the toll gate.
Which one? But we'll go on.
Because didn't the guy who did it went on to compete in the Paralympics?
No, different one.
Oh, different one.
Huh.
But yes, I will be referring to the other one. And yes, he did. So that was the driver of the subsequent
one. Yeah, and then he hit into the parked cars at the bottom of the toll gate.
Yep. Mm-hmm. And he lost a leg.
Yes.
And hence went on to be a Paralympic cycler.
Yes. And he won like gold.
Yeah, has won some medals.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of controversy because I'm pretty sure he was charged for a criminal offence.
Yes. We're going to come to a lot of this.
Okay, cool.
Nice.
We will discuss this.
Mm-hmm.
So John was sitting at a bus shelter awaiting assistance for his own truck, which he parked in a lay-by overnight due to a breakdown. The semi-trailer that hit him was travelling at uncontrolled speeds when it entered the bus stop and the lay-by on the western side of Mount Barker Road, where John was sitting. And it was determined that the injuries he sustained likely were immediately fatal.
A truck shouldn't enter a bus stop.
It shouldn't, but at 8:40 a.m. at the base of the South Eastern Freeway entering into Adelaide, it was leave and enter the lay-by in the bus stop or plough through all of the waiting peak hour traffic.
Right, so he made a choice.
So it was on Mount Barker Road, the bus stop. But he wasn't on Crossroad.
He hadn't made it through the intersection yet.
Okay.
Because the intersection essentially sounds like it was full. And so he was like, I'm going to run through all of these cars.
So he careered left.
Yes. We should clarify that we have very intimate, detailed knowledge of this area of road.
I used to drive past through that intersection every day.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've got no idea.
I'll describe it.
Did he hit the truck that was parked in the lay-by as well?
It didn't detail that specifically. So I don't know. But John was specifically sitting outside of his truck in the bus stop.
I'm just wondering, like, what visibility there was. Did he know that there was someone sitting at that bus stop when he drove into it? Like, could he have chosen the truck or the bus stop?
Unfortunately, it can't be detailed, so we don't know that. But it didn't talk about what the truck otherwise actually collided with.
Yeah, right. So maybe it was just the bus stop.
Yeah, potentially.
And that was enough to bring him to a stop.
I mean, it's a big wall behind it.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
There's enough
I'm just picturing like
just
a random
bus stop on
its own and nothing else around it.
No. There's a barrier that's going to prevent the truck from going anywhere else. So additionally, a second individual was also struck by the truck. Sorry, I should have probably brought this up. This individual was changing the tyre of his private vehicle and hence had also pulled over into that lay-by as well and received serious injuries but not fatal.
That's terrifying for both of those people seeing a truck just coming towards them.
Yeah. Yeah, it would have been horrible being like, where do you go? Yeah. How do you get out of its way? Unclear. Yeah. So the driver of the truck was a gentleman called Mr. Walsh, and he was also severely injured at the time of the accident, but survived. And so much like previous inquests that I've covered with regards to road traffic accidents, ultimately we talk a lot more about the driver than the actual individual who is deceased in this case, because that's where we gain the most information. So this is where I'm going to break off and be like, let's not kid ourselves here and say that, you know, we just happen to have these cases sitting around and know them. We obviously have to do some research and find some things that we think are relevant to present. Obviously, I had a few backed up that I was like, yeah, cool, they are going to make for reasonable presentations for the podcast, but otherwise I do have to search them. So the lesson here is read them before you choose to present them.
Why?
Because I did a bit of a glance through, saw that there were a good number of recommendations, was like, happy days, this will make a suitable case.
Yep.
But I didn't in detail read the recommendations because one of the first or second recommendations was like, and for further recommendations, please also see this other inquest.
Ugh. Oh, no.
That was of equal length to the lengthy one that I am reporting on today. So then I had to read the subsequent inquest, and that subsequent was the inquest into the death of James William Venning, who died on the 18th of January 2014 as a result of another uncontrolled truck.
And that was in the same location.
Yeah.
So let me detail about the actual intersection. So the South Eastern Freeway that comes down on an incline, it's not gently spiraling this time, but it is.
It's a long descent. Yeah.
And then that ends with the very end bit of Mount Barker Road, which goes into a intersection that's actually got 3 exits to it. So it's kind of like you can go left down Crossroad, you can go straight down Glen Osmond Road, and you can go right down Portrush Road, or west, north, west, north.
And is this a big intersection, like each direction has multiple lanes?
Yep. So Mount Barker Road has 3 lanes on each side, separated by a concrete barrier.
Okay.
And then all of those other 3 prongs of roads are 2 lanes of traffic each direction as well.
With turning lanes.
Yeah. But fairly major
That's a pretty
roads
big intersection, yeah.
for Adelaide.
It's one of the main intersections in Adelaide.
Mm.
The second truck accident didn't end up in that lay-by, but in fact actually went through the intersection.
Oh, okay.
And I can't remember.
So when you're going down the freeway, it went slightly to the left onto Crossroads.
And it hit the
parked
waterfall.
car. Yeah, it hit the waterfall, the parked car that was stopped at Crossroads going forward to Portrush Road. And went into that waterfall.
So there's also a third accident. And again, this referred to the second inquest, which then in the second inquest referred to the third inquest. I was like, I don't want to read another one, but that one hasn't been released yet because of criminal prosecution, which was another bit of a critique from this coroner of like, I'm being held up because of criminal prosecution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so that one also happened in 2015. And that one went down, I think, Glen Osmond Road, so the middle branch, into some parked cars as well.
Mm. What do you think the chances are that that third inquest will reference a fourth inquest?
There have not, as far as I'm aware, been any subsequent accidents like this.
Okay, well, that's good.
But yeah, it's always been known as a really problematic intersection for decades. And there are literally structures we've been referring to around the corners of the intersection that are hard structures designed.
But one of them is also a petrol station. So
that's why they put up those ugly trees. Those concrete trees are literally there to prevent any truck from crashing into the petrol station.
Because that would be bad.
Real bad. On the corner where obviously there's going to be a huge risk of any out-of-control travelling vehicles is a big wall structure that then has this decorative waterfall.
Right.
Is literally there to prevent.
Yeah, it's a barrier wall. The second one happened overnight, sort of about midnight.
Oh, okay.
And so that's the other reason why it sort of, I guess, progressed into the waterfall because there was less traffic.
Yep.
Yeah.
So that one, he attempted to go left down Cross Road, but couldn't make it and so tipped and went into the waterfall. But had been able to maneuver around traffic at the intersection at least. Yep. But obviously still had to find a way to stop in some way.
Yeah.
And the thing is that, like, you're not really coming to particularly flat sections of road even once you end that intersection.
Glen Osmond Road going down is
everything is still going
decline.
downhill because, I mean, if you keep driving, eventually you're basically going to hit beach.
Yeah.
So, like, it's all going towards sea level.
Yeah, okay.
Anyway, so that is a lot of early detail into the accidents that have occurred and to try to set the scene. And my mistakes in terms of how many inquests I had to read for this. So I'm just going to detail the actual events of this one case now. Mm-hmm. But when I'm listing recommendations, they may have come from either this or the other inquest, which I just grabbed the recommendations out of. I did not read then the full second inquest.
Yeah.
If you want to learn more about the second inquest, I will link it in. But I did not necessarily read it all, so please don't get upset if it's not entirely 100% accurate. Okay. The semi-trailer that was being driven was a prime mover with a trailer attached that was carrying steel.
Oh.
Together, these amounted to a total mass of 37.8 tons.
That's a lot of weight.
That is a huge amount of weight. So the speed limit coming down the South Eastern Freeway at the time of this accident was 100 kilometres an hour.
Mm-hmm.
But by the time you made it to this intersection, you had to have slowed to 60 to obviously stop at the lights and choose your direction, etc.
Makes sense.
And the calculation of the speed that the truck was travelling when it entered the bus stop was about 124 kilometres per hour.
Ooh, that's a lot of
velocity, a lot of force.
Force.
Yeah. The fact that
mass
there's
and that
something that
acceleration.
stopped it, like, you know, a big enough wall to have stopped it is pretty good. Like,
Yeah, that's
Would
kind
have
of
had to be-
incredible by itself.
yeah, reasonable structure to stop it from moving. And so, for all intents and purposes, the vehicle was otherwise being controlled by the driver, Mr. Walsh, but was out of control with the speed only, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so he was fully conscious, he was able to steer the vehicle, but he wasn't able to slow it down or stop it.
He has no memory of events, so we can't 100% say that he was conscious,
Okay.
but the fact that he pulled into the lay-by suggests that there was thought processing and
Yep.
that he was able to do that.
And he was able to steer it
In that
there
direction.
rather than just going straight.
Yeah. So the main concerns that were addressed in this inquest were addressing potential changes and concerns around whether things can be done to improve this very risky stretch of freeway. This include looking at the trucking company that he was hired by or that he was working for, the experience of Mr. Welsh, the driver, the vehicle and how well it was maintained and its quality, the use of arrestor beds. So there are arrestor beds, or otherwise now known as safety ramps, available down this stretch of freeway that he could have pulled into.
I wonder why they were called arrestor beds. Like, did you get arrested if you used them?
No, it means arresters in stop. Yeah.
Because that used to be a rumor that, like, trucks never used them because they would get fired.
Yeah, so we'll
if they
talk about
used
that.
them.
Oh, I've never heard that.
I mean, actually, I can just go into it. So they're essentially sand beds that bog the vehicle.
Mm-hmm.
And they usually go, like, you're going down a hill and they go up
They
a
go
slope,
up,
don't
yeah.
they?
I think the main concern is you bog the truck, so
Yeah.
that's an expense.
You are stuck.
Yeah.
You need to get a tow truck to get you out.
So
Yeah.
that would be at the expense of the trucking company. And
Yeah.
so therefore, I guess the driver would be nervous that if they used it and it costs all that to the trucking company,
Mm-hmm.
was that going to risk their employment?
Mm.
And there are two at the base of the freeway. So he potentially could have used the first, but even by the second, he would have definitely known that there was going to be a problem with
Yeah.
stopping. So there was no evidence that the company he worked for had suggested or put any pressure around avoiding their use.
Mm-hmm.
There was no obvious evidence to suggest there was a reason for not using them.
Right.
And so the coroner said something like, if Mr. Walsh knew about the safety ramps, why he did not use the second last one at the end of the freeway that he could have used, because by then at that point he would have known he was out of control in terms of his speed,
Yeah.
is beyond the comprehension of the court.
Interesting.
At the time of the incident, and even now, it was not an offence to fail to use the safety ramp or the arrestor bed, whatever you want to call it. And so the coroner was of the thought that there should be a change in the way that these are legislated and that there should be a regime of significant penalty for the non-user of the safety ramp, especially if it would have prevented a fatality. So basically saying that realistically, Mr. Walsh should have been penalised for not using it and that should be used as a way to encourage people to actually use them. Additional things that happened since this inquest was that the government has announced that it'll meet the costs of the removal of the heavy vehicles from these emergency use areas.
That's good.
Mm-hmm.
To reduce the discouragement of their use. Additionally, there's a document that has been updated called the Right Gear document, and that's educational information for truck drivers that talks about how to drive trucks safely, how to choose the right gear for when you're driving down descents like this, which we'll go into. And that has been updated to detail the use of arrestor beds and that you should use them as early as possible and that you shouldn't be concerned about using them. That if you need to use it, you just use it. And the coroner also further recommended consideration of a third arrestor bed so that there's an additional option, which I think sounded like was going to be placed even lower down the descent to give it, an even closer to the intersection option. Consideration, and this is a weird one, of a mandatory stopping area prior to the second arrestor bed, which requires that the vehicle stops to prove that it can
come to a complete stop.
And if it's incapable, therefore, it is mandatory that it must drive into the subsequent arrest bed.
How does that work for all the traffic that's behind it? Because I'm assuming that's only applying to trucks, not cars.
Yeah, trucks only.
So you're a car just driving down this road and then all of a sudden
I assume it would be like a pull-off lane that they're trying to design. Yeah, I know. I was like, there's no like practical way that I think that could actually happen. Yeah. So I'm not convinced that that's a reasonable option. I like the idea.
I like the thinking, the lateral thinking, but
also it's like, again, if it's a pull-off lane and you get one truck behind another that can't stop, it's plowing through that other truck, you know?
Yeah.
So again, I can't see a practical way that you would do it. And then also they've just cleaned up and put some more signs in. So they've tried to reduce foliage around the arrestor beds so there's a clearer view of them, and put up bigger signs so that people have more idea of their existence and that they should use them. So that has also been improved since this and the other incidents that have occurred.
Do you reckon that, my brain's just thinking weird things at the moment. Do you reckon that just normal people like you or me have driven up arrested beds before? Like, they're kind of tempting to be like, I wonder what it's like.
So an expert witness did detail that they are used not infrequently.
Yeah, okay.
And suggested that the frequency was unlikely to diminish in the current conditions of the road. So it does sound like they are used by trucks, not on an everyday basis, but, you know, enough to be like,
they are getting used.
We use them, but it didn't detail about other...
Because don't you just get sometimes tempted to be like, I wonder, when you're driving past, be like, I wonder what it would be like to just...
Well, there is a risk that cars would lose their brakes as well.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, no, but I'm just saying without actually needing it.
Look... Yes, but you bog your vehicle and then you destroy your vehicle, so pros and cons, you know.
And then potentially a semi comes up that can't stop and plows into you.
And it's going to go further into that arrestor bed than your car will because it's got high velocity and stuff like that. But I didn't detail that, sorry. That'll have to be one for homework. Last recommendation in relation to this, and I think it has happened from the last time I drove down the freeway, the installation of speed detection equipment. So the slow down for Sam signs that tell you how fast you're going.
Yeah.
I think they have been installed. So at least when you're going down, it tells you what speed you're doing and you can assess how far you are over the speed limit at that point. And another sort of trigger mechanism to be like, oh, I'm going way too fast to be here. And so they're, you know, within a like distance of the arrestor bed to be like, if you're going too fast, please use this.
Mm-hmm.
Just as another attempt to try and prompt people to use them.
Yeah.
Let's get to the actual driving bit. Oh, I haven't even told you about Mr. Walsh. Mr. Walsh was 30 at the time of the accident, and he had obtained his heavy rigid vehicle license 2 years prior to the accident and his heavy combination license 12 months prior. I have no idea what the difference between the two of those are, so...
Me neither.
He was hired by a company called In Front Transport, and it was identified during the inquest that on Mr. Walsh's resume that he provided for obtaining this employment, that he had detailed holding these licenses for 4 years prior.
Okay.
Mr. Walsh was only able to explain this as a typo in questioning during the inquest. And he only commenced his employment with them about a week prior to this accident.
Ooh. Had he been employed as a truck driver before? Like, obviously he got his license before, but...
Prior to this employment, he had not completed any interstate truck driving, but did have small amounts of truck driving, enough that he got a license prior, but it didn't really go into any long-term employment or anything like that as a truck driver.
Not super experienced.
Yeah. And prior to this particular drive down the South Eastern Freeway, he had only completed the journey twice before, in a truck at least, and those were in that week that he was employed with IFT. And so, yeah, his experience was pretty limited prior to this employment. And during this week that he was employed by them, he wasn't given any kind of safety advice or education about how to descend the South Eastern Freeway appropriately in terms of driving a truck and the things that come with that, which I'll talk about. And so it was identified that he probably rode the brakes the whole way down, causing them to stop working because they were overheated, and hence what led to him not being able to control the speed of the vehicle. Mr. Walsh did in fact plead guilty to 2 counts of aggravated driving without due care, and among other penalties, ultimately was sentenced to a suspended term of imprisonment of 5 months and disqualified from holding or obtaining a driver's license for a period of 2 years.
Only 2 years?
Yeah, the coroner was not entirely pleased with. And then just in terms of like he only got a charge of driving without due care, but this was just because...
Yeah, wouldn't you think manslaughter?
Yeah, so they argued that some of the other employment issues, his inexperience that wasn't particularly well managed.
Yeah.
Therefore, it essentially, because he was unaware of his surroundings, including relevant signage about using the arrestor beds and stuff like that, was where it became driving without due care rather than manslaughter.
But I don't know. Look, I understand that's what was found, but especially with arrestor beds, like I feel like most people, truck driver or not, know what they're for and know when to use them.
He said he knew, like, that they existed.
Then how are they putting that as a reason for why he shouldn't be charged with manslaughter?
I guess they're saying that the other stuff about him not knowing how to have driven down there safely was a, issue with his employment and that he should have been educated better. And so therefore, like if he'd never been driving down in the first place and he'd been told how to drive down there properly, then it wouldn't have occurred, I guess. He was also amnesic of events leading up to the crash.
Yeah, I was going to ask, was there some rationale for him not using it, but he got amnesia, not just the crash itself, but some time before that.
He could provide some detail, but not a lot of detail. So IFT. The truck was part of a fleet for IFT and also employed Mr. Walsh. This company was operated by a female director who also completed bookkeeping duties, whereas her husband owned the vehicles through finance and completed both truck driving and minor maintenance on the vehicles, including the brake adjustments.
Well, he was or was not a qualified mechanic.
Not as far as it detailed.
Good.
Major maintenance works were outsourced, though, when required.
Oh, the major ones, yeah.
There was little or no record keeping in relation to the routine maintenance that the male truck owner did, though.
Cool.
And just like of note for this company, so it had only been established 3 months prior to this accident. Prior to that, it was actually essentially the same business but under a different name, owned by the same people.
Yeah.
But this previous trucking business had actually been operated by the male truck owner who had declared personal bankruptcy and so hence couldn't go on to establish a new company as a director.
So they just put it under the wife's name.
Yeah, so... yeah, he was unable to act as a director because it's illegal if you're bankrupt to be a director of a business.
Yep.
And so hence his wife completed this role. Following the accident, the director of IFT, the wife, also declared personal bankruptcy. And essentially, I don't think that she was entirely aware of the role that she was playing in the company in terms of taking on that directorship.
Right.
And so it very much sounded like the company ran exactly the same, just with a new name.
But, she has to sign documents and stuff to have the company established. Like, she...
Yeah, I mean, like, she obviously signed stuff, but it was just like, honey, sign this.
Yeah, he was like, can you just sign this for me? It's for the business. And she's like, yeah, okay.
Yeah, no worries. But he claimed he was not running the business. He claimed he was just driving the trucks. But it sounds very much like not a lot had changed, allegedly. Anyway, so obviously the coroner made the point that it suggests the company had some potential financial pressures based on their history and that there was a fair indication from all of this that the company was being conducted in a relatively dysfunctional manner as well.
Yeah.
Which we've learned from plenty of inquests previously that dysfunctional organisations with financial pressures are at higher risk, I would think, of things going poorly, such as leading to a coronial inquest, because it's not the first time that we've talked about a company that's under financial pressure.
Yes.
And it was noted that the load being delivered on the day of this accident was potentially quite lucrative to the business, and hence there was high pressure to meet the demand, which included being delivered on time. So this section of road, it's actually governed by a section of the Australian road rules that apply to South Australia. This is section 108 if you want to, look it up and have a good read.
What's section 108?
It states that if the driver of a truck or a bus is driving on a length of road which a low gear sign applies, the driver must drive that truck or bus in a gear that is low enough to limit the speed of the truck without using the primary brake. So basically just engine reduction of speed.
Yeah. Yep. You see those signs everywhere. The trucks use low gear signs.
Yeah. An expert witness who provided some detail in this, I also want to go on to mention to say that he had a full page dedicated just to his credentials and experience in the inquest, which seemed excessive. I would have just done with your title and your position and be like, he has lots of experience.
Yeah, but this guy earned it. He did all
This guy did in fact earn it.
It's not like he's going into his personal detail. It's like he's qualified.
Yeah, so qualified. Anyway, he detailed that typically a third or fourth gear in the low range would be sufficient to ensure low speeds and appropriate engine revs. And for reference, this truck had 18 gears.
Yeah, wow.
Which seems like a lot of gears to me. And I don't know what third or fourth in low range means, but basically...
Seems pretty low, though.
Yeah, that sounds quite slow.
Yeah.
In terms of the amount of speed the engine would allow you
to have.
To reach.
Yeah. And essentially, if you had not selected such a low gear before the descent, then you wouldn't be able to select it if you had already started increasing your speeds too high.
Yep.
And so the way to counteract that is a forceful application of the foot brake to sufficiently slow the vehicle to then be able to return to that suitably low gear, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so you need to be planning for it
early, but if you hadn't...
as you're coming down this hill.
But if you hadn't, then the way to do it is sort of the stop and restart situation rather than just riding the whole way and hoping
for the best.
Yeah. It was unable to be determined what approach Mr. Walsh took to try to slow the vehicle during his descent, as he was amnesic of the events surrounding the accident. However, the truck was found to be in neutral following the accident, and Mr. Walsh at some point did describe during the inquest that he had commenced in a low gear, but at some point the truck had come out of gear without any obvious reason as to why. And then, because it was out of gear, he gained speed and was unable to return to the low gear. But there was sort of no evidence to suggest Mr. Walsh should then attempt to stop the vehicle when he realised he was unable to select the appropriate gear, such as by slowing to then go back into the right gear. And this explanation that he provided in this inquest was also in contrast to the one he provided during his criminal proceedings. I didn't actually go into what he provided in his criminal proceedings, but it's just highlighting that there was conflicting information provided. And I think that comes back to that situation of like the criminal proceedings were closer to the time of the event, and then these were, several years again later. And it's just interesting how things change along the way in terms of from your memory as well, I think.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So not to say that that conflict was necessarily to say that at one point or the other he was lying. It was just that his memory had changed by that point.
Yeah.
Mr. Walsh did detail that on the first two occasions when he travelled down the freeway that he did in fact select the low gear and that he was aware to do this and was able to safely navigate that as per the Australian road rules. But evidence presented by a witness that had seen him on a previous travel had suggested that the vehicle was smoking on the way down, which could suggest that this was as a result of the brakes being used excessively, such as by riding the brakes. So there was also concern that his inexperience meant that he was, in fact, not appropriately following that road rule.
Yeah.
On review of the truck following the accident, there was no evidence of concern to the gearbox to suggest that it should have spontaneously jumped out of gear, or that there is any reason for that was reported by Mr. Walsh. And so that expert witness, therefore, felt that the more preferable explanation was that he selected the wrong gear in the first place and tried to, therefore, get into the lower gear and couldn't, and therefore ultimately left it in neutral because he couldn't get into the gear he wanted, and then just relied on the brakes from there.
Right.
Or that something had happened at the bottom and it ended up in neutral, but ultimately suggestion being that he therefore was relying on the brakes. So the coroner was hugely critical of the regulations of this road rule, and on review, the penalty for contravention of Section 108 of the road rule is a fine of $325 and loss of 3 demerit points.
Is that it?
Yes.
And do truck drivers have the same amount of demerit points on their licenses?
I have no idea how many. I don't even know how many
that's a good question.
demerit points I have. So, who knows? It's just, so disproportionate to, the risk involved. Oh, yeah,
but I'm just, curious because if 3 demerit points is, and they only have 6.
Yeah, true.
Then I don't think that's the case, though.
But there's also these arguments around, if it's going to significantly affect your employment, that's going to mean that you're going to be hard off or whatever. Often you end up getting your license reinstated anyway, even if you lose all your points. So, I don't know, demerit points to me just seem not particularly helpful if you're able to argue your way out of them. But yeah, anyway, the coroner stated this seemed wholly disproportionate to the seriousness of the matter.
Oh, for sure.
And so recommended the penalty be increased and include both a period of disqualification of driver's license and the possibility of imprisonment, especially if in relation to the prevention of death.
Just quickly, in South Australia, it looks like you have 12.
12? Oh, wow,
Like,
that is so many more than I thought.
And they're saying you don't lose them, but you can acquire them. So I think it's slightly different. So there you start with 0.
Right.
If you accrue 12 or more within a 3-year period, you can be disqualified.
Right. That may just have been a change since this, because it said loss specifically in this, so it may have been a change in time. But
it works the same.
Yeah, same.
Yeah.
It's just trying to be less negative.
Yeah.
Yeah, instead of losing them,
you gain them.
Which is not a good thing.
Since these truck accidents, to reduce the risks of uncontrolled speeds, they've implemented new signage and speed limits travelling down this stretch of freeway. So it's now actually been altered to be 60 kilometres per hour from Stirling, which is not quite the top or entry point or initiation of this particular steep descent, but fairly far. That is therefore ultimately causing them to be, really effectively at a low speed from early on.
Yeah, and that's bad because they take up the whole lane.
It's got 3 lanes.
But also everyone's doing 60.
No, so only for the trucks, sorry.
Oh.
So if you are driving a vehicle that is regulated by this Rule 108, so trucks or buses, therefore must travel down at 60 kilometres in the left lane, unless overtaking, for the whole period. So yes, it does effectively use up one whole lane for trucks only.
Right. But it sounds like there's quite a few trucks travelling down there.
Yeah, that's...
Was a major entry point into Adelaide from interstate.
From Melbourne.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, sorry, IFT was located in Melbourne and they were doing an interstate delivery from Melbourne to Adelaide. As I mentioned, there's also been this new publication, The Right Gear, that's been updated and distributed to stakeholders to emphasise and remind people of their legal obligation when driving heavy vehicles down this include Another thing that the coroner emphasised in his recommendations was the importance of driver accountability, and that driver education should include the required manner of driving on downhill gradients and be rigorous enough to detect when a driver might be at risk of dangerous driving when traversing these roads before they're even able to obtain their licence. So basically being like, well, if you're a driver, you should be aware, you should be taking accountability, you should be making sure that you are on top of this as an issue, but also you shouldn't get your licence if you're not aware or not able to follow these rules, which in theory, one would have thought that. But at the same time, I don't know, the coroner kept making all these sort of recommendations around being able to traverse such a area that has a descent like this. But I'm like, how many roads like this exist in Australia?
Like, I can't really think of it. Yeah, like Toowoomba's probably the only one, like in terms of Brisbane surrounds. Toowoomba's really the only one that I can think of
that has a similar descent and gradient like that. I don't know, just like he kept referring to the South Eastern Freeway and all truck drivers in the whole of Australia should know how to traverse said descent. And I'm like, that's oddly specific.
Yeah.
Yeah, like if you're just a Queensland-based truck driver, you're not going to know, and you don't need to know because you're never going to drive there.
So the coroner went on to state that he felt that all interstate drivers should be required to possess a certificate of demonstrated competence in respect to the ability to perform a safe descent of the South Eastern Freeway.
Oh, wow.
No,
and I was like...
That's super niche.
Yeah, I was like, just a safe descent, not like specific to this one road. Like, it just seemed, And then that they should maintain a log in regards to all descents performed.
And just be like, tick, didn't kill anyone?
Yeah, and that this log should be located in the vehicle driven by the driver at all times. And I was like, that's a lot for them to have to maintain and and
especially if they're doing it like several times a day.
Yeah, well, but I was also like, I get your desire for them to have accountability, but I think that that's maybe a little too far because that's then sort of distracting them away from like their primary purpose. And there'd be so many truck drivers that do it on an everyday basis that therefore have a very good idea of how to do it safely. And so I think it's targeting to make sure that those are getting their license, knowing
then
that
maybe it should be a stipulation like that of like within the first 12 months. Or something like that. And then once next experience has been...
Well, if you're in Adelaide, maybe it's part of your getting your license.
Yeah.
Well, even if it was
Adelaide
implemented...
truck driver, is you go up and down there.
No, but there's still be a lot of interstate travel. But like, even if it's implemented as part of getting your license, you have to have proven you can do a steep descent as part of your...
like that would make sense.
Getting a license.
South Eastern Freeway could be one of the approved locations but, have them accessible.
Yeah.
But because doing a log as well is not going to change the fact that you might be super experienced, but there's a mechanical malfunction, or you have a
what if you're
loss of
riding the brakes
consciousness.
every single time?
Yeah.
And
like,
you just don't happen to lose them every single time until that final time that you do. Like, it's not
necessarily going to stop an accident from happening just because you've done it a lot.
Yeah.
Less likely, but...
So, yeah, for me, I just thought that was getting a little too much from that perspective. So, as we've said, he didn't do particularly well with the gears. The other thing that wasn't ideal was the brakes. So once he was in neutral, he was therefore entirely reliant on the primary brakes to slow the vehicle. These were reviewed following the accident by an expert witness, and the expert witness found that the prime mover brakes, so the truck and front portion, had been severely overheated, consistent with being applied for the full descent prior to the accident. And with overheating of the brakes, they become far less efficient and therefore were unable to stop the vehicle over this distance. Alternatively, no evidence of overheating was found on the brakes of the trailer, and in the expert witness's opinion, this indicated they had not been operating effectively, or essentially at all.
Right.
Yeah.
So, like, the front part of the truck was the only thing braking the entire load.
Yes. When in theory, it should be both working in combination, because remember, the truck was holding the steel, which... I don't know, they both added up to 37 tonne, but I presume the trailer and the steel was
most of that.
Yeah, majority of that weight. Additionally to them not having been used, he also found that they were in extremely poor condition and essentially detailed that basically they were sitting out of position or out of alignment, which is the reason why they hadn't actually showed evidence of overheating, because when they were engaged, they weren't actually meeting the drum of the brake to actually cause pressure to slow the vehicle.
They weren't doing anything.
Yeah,
they were just moving in space and not actually...
towards the brake, but they weren't actually applying in any way to slow the vehicle. With regards to those being out of alignment, as I said, the maintenance was performed for that by the truck owner. And it was also criticised in the report that Mr. Walsh probably should have known that these weren't working either, and that there is a simple test that can be done when you take off. You can hit both the accelerator and the brake at the same time, and essentially if you're able to move, because like the prime mover will move and then the brakes should hold, because you've got the brakes of the trailer holding as well. If the brakes of the trailer aren't holding, then the truck will in fact move, and so it could have been identified. But clearly Mr. Walsh had either been unaware or didn't do that.
Yeah, right.
To identify that. And so the coroner was like, this really should have been picked up before he started the descent in the first place.
Yeah.
And then also criticised that they should have also been better maintained.
Definitely.
And detailed that the reason why it would have taken an experienced diesel mechanic 15 minutes, 1-5, to resolve the issue identified.
Is that it? Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's not like it was going to take a full day.
Yeah. And so there isn't really a lot of argument to say, well, we couldn't afford to get the brakes reviewed at this such time when we thought they were working fine. The male owner of the vehicle did claim that he reviewed the brakes prior to the accident and found them in working order. And it was in his opinion, contrary to the experts, that any issues found with the brakes just of the trailer section was as a result of the crash and high temperatures breached by their constant application. And this was entirely refuted by all experts.
Yeah, because if they're constantly on, that doesn't mean they're going to not touch at all.
Yeah. And so, yeah, ultimately, therefore, the prime mover brakes failed. Therefore, the brakes were no longer effective, so the truck was just free travelling down the freeway. And so it was questioned, and so this comes back to where he was charged with the reckless driving. Would there have been a difference if he'd actually had brakes that worked? And so should he be held solely responsible for the accident?
Right. Okay.
And whether the vehicle would have been easier to control had the brakes actually worked.
And you would think an element of that, yes.
Well, he made it safely down the first 2 times. And so my question is, were the brakes working better the first 2 times? And that he actually drove the exact same way all 3 times, but managed to not become out of control or overheat his brakes on the first 2 because the trailer brakes were working.
Or potentially the first 2, there was another truck in front of him that was already going slowly.
Yeah,
and
to
so
keep
he
him at
went
a
slowly
slower
to match
speed
their,
and all kind of,
because they were in front of him and they were in the way.
Yeah.
And that's, so then he was automatically in a lower, like he was already in a lower gear.
Yeah, to begin with and that kind of thing.
And then didn't need the brakes as much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So many extra things that could have changed those first 2 times. So the coroner's recommendation with regards to the brakes being not well maintained was recommending roadworthy and maintenance checks for vehicles as part of legislation, and that this be undertaken on a national basis. So either as part of their registration or something like that they need to have checks to look for these kinds of issues. But I think it's hard with those brake kind of issues of like, if it's just a 15-minute fix, how often does that 15-minute fix need to happen? Is that like a once every 10 years or is that like once every 6 months? And so it's hard if you're implementing like a yearly or a 5-yearly check or whatever. But also suggested there could be some like periodic or frequent inspections and things like that could also be included. But again, we've had many other chats around like, in theory good, in reality how easy is it actually to implement. And so again has its downsides from that perspective as well. Lastly, it was questioned as to whether fatigue played a part in Mr. Walsh's ability to navigate down the descent as well. And so they looked into the last little over 24 hours of Mr. Walsh's day prior to the accident. So regulation of the Australian road rules as well. There's Regulation 6, which imposes a duty on a driver to not drive a regulated heavy vehicle on a road if that person is impaired by fatigue. And then some other additional regulations essentially impose the same responsibility on the employer to make sure that their driver doesn't drive while fatigued. Definition of fatigue includes they cannot solo drive for more than 12 hours in one 24-hour period, and that they have a minimum of a continuous 7-hour break for stationary rest time over that 24-hour period as well. Does that make sense? Work for 12, must rest for 7.
Yeah.
Cool. And noting that work includes any kind of work-related activities, not just the specifically sitting and driving. So if you're out washing your vehicle, if you're loading your vehicle, if you're doing maintenance on your vehicle, technically that still counts as working.
Yeah.
The other regulation that related to this inquest was that a driver travelling an excess of 100 kilometres away from their home base within a day must maintain a log of where they're going and the times that they're working as well, and that must be kept within the vehicle as well. So basically, I left here, when I stopped, what the odometer readings were, that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and like the location of where they stopped.
Yeah, basically. To, again, help with that record of how many hours you're working, etc. In the day prior to the accident, Mr. Walsh started at 6 a.m. and worked in and around Ballarat, Geelong and Melbourne up until 6 p.m. It was determined during that period of time that he didn't actually technically have any rest periods, although he had initially suggested that there was a period of 4 hours where he'd rested, but during that time he was having things like inductions to facilities, was tarping a load and doing other things that the coroner said. No, these are
work-related tasks, yeah.
Yeah, and so they can't be counted as downtime. So he essentially worked his 12 hours from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. already.
And that's the night before.
6 a.m. to 6 p.m. of the Monday, and then the accident happened at 8:40 on the Tuesday.
How long does it normally take to drive from Melbourne to Adelaide?
8 hours. In a car. I don't know, assuming a truck it might be slightly longer. Following completing his work at 6 p.m, he was informed that he would in fact be driving to Adelaide.
That night?
Yep.
Sure.
Just like, so by the way,
you said yes to this.
I guess he'd been employed for a week.
Employed, yeah. So he's not going to.
He's not going to say no.
Yeah. And he might have thought that was the terms of his employment.
Yeah.
Like, how much choice did he have?
Especially if that was a highly lucrative job.
So he set off in a convoy with the owner to Adelaide. And again, at this point, he said he rested at the depot for about 40 minutes. Although, when questioned further, this 40 minutes of rest included washing his vehicle and topping up the oil.
That's not rest.
So did he just not sleep for an entire day?
He gets a little bit of sleep. So they set off. A few hours in, they encountered another truck that had run out of fuel, which, I had so many questions, but we'll just move on. Anyway, the male owner stopped to assist the other driver of the other vehicle, at which point Mr. Walsh rested for 2 hours. And at that point, he was doing nothing. It was okay. He was officially actually resting. Then they pressed on. Then they had some dinner. That lasted about an hour. And then by 1 a.m, they'd stopped in a rural city outside of South Australia called Tintinara. And my understanding is Tintinara is 4 to 5 hours out of Adelaide.
Okay.
So at 1 a.m, they therefore elected to have their overnight rest, for which they both slept in the cab of the truck for up to 5 hours. At 6 a.m, they commenced their trip into Adelaide, stopping only for a coffee break at Tailem Bend, which is about an hour outside of Adelaide. So they had 5 hours rest overnight.
But after doing a 12-hour day and then...
Yeah.
Like, that amount of rest, if you'd not been working the day before, maybe okay, but having worked a full day the day before.
I agree that there was not enough. He did at least get some sleep. It wasn't like he'd worked the full 24 hours with, like, zero rest. Because when I was first reading it and trying to add up these hours as well, I was like,
Wait,
is he not stopping at all at any point? So this information was all determined through Mr. Walsh's driving diary, although some of the times and locations were not entirely accurate, therefore had to be judged by, like, other CCTV and other things, because his diary said that he stopped at, like, midnight in, like, a different city or country town. So also, like, why did you not know where you stopped? But anyway.
Unless you were deliberately fudging the books.
Potentially.
To make it seem like you were getting more rest than you actually were.
Yeah. But that's allegedly, we don't actually know why. And the last entry was prior to the sleeping stop. And so there's not technically documentation about when they got up and when they left, but there was evidence that they had their coffee break in Tailem Bend. And so they know where they stopped and the time to get to Tailem Bend so they can approximate from there.
Yeah.
And then, look, this, inconsistencies in Mr. Walsh's was a vast improvement on the male truck owners who had not completed any entries in his work diary since the 4th of October, a full week prior to the accident. So,
it's not exactly learning by example.
Not at all. So the coroner essentially concluded that due to the inconsistent timeline, that in the 24 hours prior to the accident, it was difficult to determine if he'd actually worked more than the 12 hours allowed, but that he obviously hadn't had the continuous 7 hours because that, there's evidence of CCTV that he was definitely driving still at, like, midnight and that he was in Tailem Bend by 6:30. And so that definitely could not have been more than 7 hours continuous. It was suggested that essentially the 2-hour delay helping their colleague was the reason why they were unable to complete the 7-hour break. In theory, if they hadn't stopped for that, they would have arrived at Tintinara earlier, they would have gotten to their cabs, they would have slept for longer, it would have been 7 hours continuous. And so that's the argument as to why that didn't happen. And then obviously they had a timeline as to when they needed to deliver the load in Adelaide on that morning, and that's why they had to set off at the time that they had to set off.
You know what really stops you from reaching your target time is crashing into something.
Yeah, I'm like, yes, the steel obviously didn't get delivered, did it? And they were doing that because there were financial pressures. So again, it all circles back to, they had to achieve that deadline. Also, like, maybe if that other truck hadn't run out of petrol, which again is another question that I have that did not detail what was going on there. Ultimately, it could not be excluded that fatigue contributed to the possibility that Mr. Walsh was unable to select the appropriate gear for the descent on the South Eastern Freeway. But as I said, I didn't actually look into what penalties are imposed onto the organisation with regards to both the brakes and the fatigue. So, final little recommendation that the coroner gave that was unrelated to all of that was around third-party compulsory insurance. So in Australia, there is the requirement for all vehicles that are registered to have compulsory third-party bodily injury insurance. It's also compulsory for you to drive a registered vehicle. So in theory, all vehicles have this. But sometimes people drive unregistered vehicles. And basically, that's a compensation scheme that if there's any accident that causes death or bodily injury, the person who that occurs to, at least, there is insurance available to provide them with assistance, irrespective of how much wealth that person who caused the accident has.
But it's also good for things like if you're driving alone and you hit a kangaroo and you're injured.
Yeah.
There's obviously no other party involved, but
True.
You have access to insurance for that accident.
Yeah. And so at the moment, there is then no legislation or precedent with regards to the insurer being able to claim against the party involved who is negligent. And so the coroner was suggesting that there should be a way that if the driver or the vehicle owner or the operator of the business for which the vehicle relates is found to be negligent or a cause for that accident, that therefore the insurance should be able to then claim a civil suit against that organisation for that cost, and so recommended that legislation should be changed. And so that is that. Mr. James William Venning was one of the truck drivers in the second inquest. Basically had very similar circumstances in terms of brakes didn't work effectively, was not experienced at driving down this area of road, hadn't been using appropriate gears, and didn't take any of the arrestor beds.
Was it only him that was killed?
Yeah, he collided with the wall barrier at the end of the South Eastern Freeway. But because it was 12 a.m, there were less vehicles around to result in injury to others. Yeah. And the third one that's still pending, which has had criminal prosecutions, and hence the coronial investigation is still going, which is the one in relation to that Paralympian. So he ultimately was charged but not convicted.
Yeah.
So then could go on to compete in the Paralympics. And again, I think there's similar circumstances around. He was inexperienced and therefore accidents happen. But we'll wait for that inquest to come out and then one of you guys can present it because I'm done reading about the South Eastern Freeway.
Fair. It's interesting though.
If I'd known it was 2, I probably wouldn't have.
You would have made different choices.
But like this one, it's an area I know very well. Like I can think, see, picture all of it in my mind. And look, lots of changes have been made to that area, right? Like, again, as I said, trucks can only travel 60 down there now. So the implementation of those changes is trying to prevent. And, you know, we think the last one happened in 2015. So we've made it a good number of years since there's been a significant crash. But it's still going to...
Yeah, hopefully that doesn't change anytime soon.
But it's still such a risky portion of road either way.
It is.
And there's not a lot of change you can make to the
road itself.
In terms of that descent still has to be traversed in some way. So, yeah.
Side note, I looked up the intersection and those trees are very ugly. They look like pencils.
They're interesting.